exactly what she would do. I mean, she was uncanny in her capacity to see what needed to be done, go in and do it without a stitch of fanfare. Not, look what I did, or, oh, I had to go do this. Just did it. Yep. Incredibly hardworking. Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
What's Katie doing now?
Katie is a sophomore at U of I, at University of Illinois.
Awesome.
Just took her back to school.
In Champaign?
In Champaign, yeah. So she's doing great.
Whenever you guys are ready.
All right. Well, let's begin by just saying who you are. So just do the quick intro of, well, take your time. Use an I statement. My name is, I was the vicar from Grace from the whole blah, and you could say what you do now too.
Sure. Sure. Okay. All right. Well, I'm Reverend Sue Sommer, and I was at Grace from 1999 until 2005. I left here to go serve as subdean and canon pastor at Grace and Holy Trinity Cathedral in Kansas City, Missouri. Did that for about 8 years, and then missed this part of the world so much that it was time to come back, and now I serve St. David's in Glenview, and I've been there for 5 years.
Now, how did you arrive at Grace? What was the process like for the call?
Well, it was fascinating. The call to Grace Church, I was certainly overdue to be leaving a curate position at Emmanuel and LaGrange, where I had first served. I had had a daughter. I was aged when I had my daughter. I was 42 when I had her, and so there were obviously complications and drama and all of that. And so, but the situation came together, and Clarence Langdon, who at the time was the canon to the ordinary, put my name in at Grace and said, you should really check out New Lenox. And so I did check out New Lenox, and they checked me out, and I was interviewed, and it just felt right from that first interview, which, if memory serves, took place in my office at Emmanuel with members of the call committee.
What were your impressions of Grace when you were either interviewing or considering accepting the call?
You know, my impressions of Grace when I was interviewed, and which then came clearer to me when I was called and when I began to serve here, was what a gem of a place it is, and at the time, what felt like a hidden gem within the diocese. There was so much energy. There was so much faithfulness. And there was so much potential. Now, this was well before the I-355 exchange. We were talking about it. We knew it was coming. Who knew it would take so long? But I tell you, what impressed me the most during my interview was I asked the question, what's difficult for you all? You know, what do you find to be challenging? And Roger Whitehead said, well, sometimes we don't really want to welcome visitors. He said, we do. He said, and then that's fine, but sometimes we just want to be with our friends. And I thought, at last, a congregation that tells the truth. What I found here was that they were indeed extraordinarily welcoming of visitors, and there were a great many. We grew significantly in the time that I was here, and it was because of the congregation. It was because of the warmth and the genuine welcomingness that happened here, and the shadow challenge that I experienced with them in the time that I was with them also was that they wanted to hang out with each other. And so the welcoming of the visitors didn't always translate into the welcoming of the new coming members. And they named that too. They said that, we do sometimes, we'll welcome you as a visitor, but then we'll leave you on your own. I said, well, we'll need to work on that. And they did.
When you think of, I'm going to go off script here a little bit, but what do you remember being a really challenging time or hardship? I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you would have been here during 9/11.
Mhm.
Are there any kind of things that were either traumatic for the congregation or community that stick out to you?
We did a service that night for 9/11. I was actually on that day, I was on my way into Chicago. I had a Commission on Ministry meeting that day. I was a member of the Commission on Ministry. And so I took the train, as I always did, and with every stop, and there were plenty between here and Chicago, as people got on, there was this buzz. You know, people weren't being the quiet commuters they usually were, sort of like, did you hear, did you hear, did you hear? And so I, who had not been watching the news shows that morning, I was completely oblivious, and of course this was long before cell phones, for heaven's sakes, we got into Chicago, and the train immediately turned around. I mean, we were not allowed off. And all of the financial district was streaming onto the train. And it was standing room only. And I had my prayer book with me because I was, Commission on Ministry. And so I pulled it out because I'm thinking, we're going to have to do a service tonight. So I'm flipping through the prayer book and thinking of, how we can do this with evening prayer and what this will look like. And the people that were around me said, "Are you a minister?" And I said, "Well, yes, I am." And they said, "Would you pray with us?" On a commuter train in between Chicago and here. And so I did. So I closed my prayer book and we just prayed. And then we did the service that night. The Ministerial Association in New Lenox came together the following year to do a sort of a one-year retrospective, a one-year acknowledgement of this tragedy. But that evening, my recollection is that we all sort of did our own thing. We were so shell-shocked that it didn't dawn on any of us, certainly didn't dawn on me, let me put it that way, to reach out to my colleagues in ministry and do something together.
Also, I know I'm only bringing up traumatic United States situations, but I'm looking at the time period you're here. So you were here during the 2000 election too. And one of the things I've already identified at Grace that I think is a great part of Grace is it's very diverse politically, and yet they worship together, and I think that's such a great model.
Yes.
It's not the liberal church or the conservative church.
Yes, yes.
Really right down the middle, and I
Yes.
wonder how the church navigated the 2000 election, if you remember anything.
I don't remember it except to say your observation. I'm sorry, I didn't reintroduce it, did I? Let me start over again. The 2000 elections were interesting because Grace it certainly was, I assume it still is, a diverse congregation in terms of where you are politically. I mean, there were yellow dog Democrats and there were, dyed-in-the-wool Republicans, and it was a small enough place that y'all knew who each other was. And everyone worshiped together. And everyone acknowledged the breach that was there. I remember there was joking at one point that the Republicans should sit on the right and the Democrats should sit on the left. And then we were joking about, well, which is right and which is left, from, facing the altar or from the altar facing this way. So good humored in that respect. And again, I think that's one of the beauties of a church like Grace is that the friendships and the connections go so deep that you know that somebody sees things differently than you, and you love them anyway.
Jim, when he was here, talked about his first thing he noticed in the space was that the flags were now in the back, and he felt a little moral victory that had finally happened. I don't think that had happened when you were here.
Yes, it did.
Maybe it did.
Yes, it did.
Good. Can you recount how
Yeah,
that goes? I think time's passed now.
The flags, actually, yes, were taken to the back of the church. Actually, where I had them was out in the narthex. And then they moved to the back of the church after I left. And I was, every church has its thing. And I remember having some very impassioned conversations with George Cook, who was one of the people who was passionate about the American flag being in the worship space and about, that the First Amendment guaranteed freedom of religion, and we need to honor that. And me equally passionately saying to George, that the symbol of the church is the cross. The symbol of the church is the altar. The symbol of the church is the sacrament. And so please be as patriotic as you want to be. Please, fly that flag daily, But please understand that in this sacred space, we need to be real clear about what are the dominant symbols of our life together.
Okay, let's talk a little bit more about.
That was great.
That's been, yeah, it was really wonderful. You're just spurring all these great ideas. Any strange traditions come to mind that Grace was doing at the time? I've already encountered a few where I said, well, I'm just gonna have to participate, I guess.
Strange traditions. I started one of the strange traditions. Actually, my daughter started one of the strange traditions, which was, and I don't know that you're still doing it, but when I would process out at the end of the service, all the children would follow after me, in part because Katie was following after me, and she wanted to hold my hand, and so we would get to the back, and then we would dance to whatever the final hymn was. And so I don't, that may not have lasted beyond my tenure here, but that was a tradition that started under my tenure.
It reminds me that Grace is, we're trying desperately to keep this tradition that the children are our number one priority.
Yes.
Could you share the story about Katie at the altar, and also just what you think about children in church?
Certainly. My daughter Katie was not quite a year old when I was called to Grace. I think that actually she was the biggest reason why I was called, as I think about it now. I think that they met her and said, like, oh, we need her mom here. So she was a church kid. I mean, Rick, my husband, would come into the church and would be holding her or walking with her, and she would immediately be picked up by someone and passed around the church. And so she seldom ever stayed in one spot for the whole church service. Most of the time that worked out great. I do recall one Sunday when it was a mommy day. I mean, she was not having anything but me that day. And we worked at it and through the sermon, and by the time we got to the offertory, it was clear that I just needed to hold her. So I stood at that altar and held her in my left arm against my hip with my right hand out in the around position, thinking I'm gonna have to turn a page here sometime, but we'll work that out. And the congregation is giggling. And I'm thinking it's just because it's so hilarious to see a priest holding a child during service, particularly her own. And then I look down and I have this hand out and Katie has this hand out. And that's what everyone was giggling about. And it's one of my most cherished memories of Grace.
Gotta find a way to find a photo of that. It's so awesome. Do you want to add anything else about just the importance of children being in worship? Unless you believe they shouldn't be. Yeah. Right now, I'm hesitant to ever take them out, like for chapel or anything. I'd rather them be here the whole service. So
Right.
If you have any thoughts.
Sure. I'm aware that when, that shortly after I arrived, we started gaining families with other young children. And I think that's not unusual. I think that when the rector has a child of that age, then that's who families tend to come. I mean, I just think that's typical. My inclination was that I wanted my daughter in church. My inclination was I want kids in church because the best formation happens during church. To do Sunday school or children's church or anything during church, as far as I'm concerned, it creates a parachurch environment, and so this is where the big people are and this is where the unimportant people are. I mean, that's the subtext that gets delivered. And so how much more important to have children from infancy onward be integral parts of the life of the congregation, and to delight in their exuberance. I would do children's conversations before my homily. I would sit on the step and call the kids up, and it was always a challenge because I had to think not only of a sermon, but whatever that illustration was going to be. I had 1,000 parishioners. I had so many parishioners say, you know, I get more out of your children's sermons than I do out of your regular sermons. And I'm like, thank you, I think.
I'm so glad you said all that. I totally agree. I can't believe I forgot to ask you this, but it's noted everywhere. It's pretty obvious you're the first woman that Grace ever had as the vicar.
Yes.
I'm just curious, what did that mean to you, and what did it mean to maybe the other women here at the church, and maybe any thoughts about just women in the priesthood,
Sure.
which still
Sure.
it's still in its young phase and long scheme of it.
I was the first woman vicar of Grace Church. I think it's been my lot in life to be the first woman something or other in every church I have served. To this day, I was the first woman rector at St. David's in Glenview just 5 years ago. That was still a first for them. It was a first here, and Grace, having been around for as long as it's been around, has had an awful lot of male rectors, male vicars. So I was the first, and I suspect there were those here who raised an eyebrow or two. They did not raise it in my presence. I felt nothing but welcome. This part of the world, Chicagoland, is intensely Roman Catholic. And so many of our congregations are comprised of a great many, what we jokingly refer to as Romans in recovery, who are part of our congregations. And so over the years, a number of the women of the congregation would find an opportunity to tell me what it has meant to them to have a woman vicar. And to have a woman say the body of Christ, and to have their vicar be a mom, and to have that experience that, for many of them, was completely off their radar for the whole time that they were growing up in the Roman Catholic Church. And so it was powerful. The question always is, what are we going to call you? They asked me that question in my first church. They asked me that question at St. David's. They asked me that question here. So we settled on Reverend Sue. And that's who I still am all these years later. When I was at the cathedral in Kansas City, I was Canon Summer. That worked out well. Canon is a lovely non-gender title. But as a parish priest, Reverend Sue seems to be what fits me.
I wanted to bring up a few names. You talked about George Cook, and that's a great name. I think people will be, when you bring up these names, we'll probably intercut with
Sure.
old
Sure.
photos and things
Sure.
of them. There's a woman that people think of fondly, and I'm blanking on the last name, Mary.
Oh, Mary, yes. I was trying to remember her. I want to say Gauger, but that wasn't right. But it was Gauger.
It might be, yeah. Maybe she's a Gauger.
Yeah, I think she was, yeah. She was
Who was she?
the matriarch. Mary Gauger was the matriarch. Please check me on that name, by the way. I'm going to start over again. Please check the archives. She lived up the street. My memory. Gray hair. Look at all the gray hair. So I'll start again. Mary Gauger was the matriarch of Grace when I arrived at Grace. She sat in about the fourth pew back on that side every single Sunday. And got to the point where it was harder and harder for her to come to church. And so I would make it a point of visiting her as often as I could, and I would clean out her hearing aids for her, because I would do that for my dad. And so it was that thing. I would be aware that she was asking me to repeat myself, and I would say, Mary, can I take a look at your hearing aids for you? So it's the ministry of the hearing aids. She was a wonderful woman. She was the heartbeat of this place, and when she died, it was as though one of the pillars had fallen. She was a significant person in the life of this congregation and had been for a great many years.
What do you remember about Ed Johnson?
Oh, Ed Johnson. Let me tell you about Ed and Marilyn Johnson. Motorcyclist Ed sold motorcycle insurance and was one of those rare guys who was as at home with the orthodontist who bought the Harley as he was with the outlaw biker guys. I mean, he could seamlessly travel between these groups. And when he died on his motorcycle, not at fault, he was hit, we had a biker funeral. We had a biker funeral at Grace that was the biggest thing we'd ever had. I think at Grace, I think it may still hold the record. We had about 250 people, if you can imagine. Most of them wearing leather on that day. And a procession from this space to the cemetery that involved, I don't know how many bikers that couldn't even fit into the church. I alerted the police and the sheriff ahead of time that this was going on, and of course they knew Ed. I mean, you know, he was very well known and very well beloved in this area. What we ended up doing, actually my husband, who had some skill set in audiovisual stuff, set up a feed down in the parish hall. And so we had a whole bunch of people down in the parish hall, and as many as could fit in here. It was standing room only. And it was amazing. It was absolutely amazing. Yeah. Biker funeral.
Not quite a biker, although she'd probably be good at it. Diane Gerald's is still a fixture here, often doing things secretly for the good of the church. Is that what you remember of her?
Diane Gerald's is one of the saints of the church. What I recall of Diane was her boundless energy. I mean, she worked long hours, and she found time and energy to come over and, I don't know, empty wastebaskets, dig up some weeds. Diane was one of those people who saw something that needed to be done and did it without fanfare, without any drama, simply did it. And did it so seamlessly that sometimes, to my everlasting shame, I would forget to thank her because she kept such a low profile. She is an amazing woman. What a gift to the church.
Just probably a few more questions, but I could do this for days. This is great. This is really terrific. Do you talk about New Lenox a little bit? It's
sure.
Kind of a peculiar town.
Oh, it's a very peculiar town,
Or
yes.
suburb, or whatever we call it. And it's, as you probably could see driving in, it's changing a lot already. The train depot is changing. We're getting new bakeries and coffee shops and all. What is your recollection of New Lenox at the time, and how the church fit into the...
One of the challenges for me when I arrived here was the fact that New Lenox doesn't really have a downtown, or certainly didn't when I was here. It was really hard to sort of figure out, where is New Lenox? Certainly Grace being an historic building, I mean, clearly this was at some point the epicenter of something, but so very difficult to see. And with the Lincoln Way communities all sort of merging into each other, Frankfort had a downtown, Mokina had a downtown, Joliet had a downtown, New Lenox, not so much. It made it difficult because the churches I had served, the churches I grew up in, the churches I've served, they were all focused within the life of a community. And when I was here, there wasn't like there was a coffee shop you could walk to. There wasn't a centered place. It felt much more diffused. And I certainly was aware too, and this was very different also than the first church I served, or subsequent churches, is that Grace was peopled by the suburban exhausted. I mean, these were people who traveled great distances at a time before we had open tolling on the tollways. If they worked downtown, you're almost at the end of the line. If you worked in another suburb, you couldn't get there from here. It's much easier now with 355, but at the time, people worked long hours and then they had a long commute. And so by the time Sunday rolled around, I was amazed at the energy that they had, frankly. It was, because it was so exurban at that time. I think that's changing. Certainly when I drove in today, it's more built up, but it still lacks a downtown, doesn't it? That still is something that Leonardics will probably need to work on for a very long time.
So I totally agree. Now, as we kind of wind down, and jump in if you've got other fond memories, but I wanted to have you reflect on Process Allow, what it means for a church to be 150 years old, especially an Episcopal church.
Yeah. Think about that.
Take your time.
You know, I think it's a remarkable thing for a church to have 150 years under its belt. I mean, I think in general that's an astonishing thing. The church I grew up in Jackson, Michigan was that old. It had been founded in the 1830s, so it's been around for a long time. The Diocese of Chicago, frankly, has not been around for 150 years. Grace Neolanics predates the formation of this diocese. I think what's remarkable is a church that has had as many vicars as it has had. I remember being astonished by that when I came and learning how very many vicars preceded me. And then, of course, becoming aware of the tradition that Neolanics and other mission churches like it would be where a newly minted priest would cut his teeth before going on to someplace else. And so there was a constant turnover, and that in itself, if it doesn't kill you, will make you strong. And I think it made Grace strong, and I think that they began to understand many, many, many years ago that their identity was them and not the priest who led them. And I think that in this diocese that has such a orientation of Anglo-Catholicism, that we're so priest-centered in so many ways, I think that has been a strength of Grace's all along in a way that has not been for other churches. And I think that's why Grace is still here, very frankly. You know, when I think of the churches that have imploded, it has often been because the charismatic rector left and they could not cope, or the charismatic rector got in a fight with someone, or the charismatic rector, and I'm saying charismatic with a small c here, somehow there was something that caused a split or that caused drama of some sort or other. And nobody ever said these words to me at Grace, but I was always aware that they were here long before I arrived, and they would be here long after I left. And so there was enormous freedom in that, honestly. There was enormous freedom in that because they are such a loving congregation and so gifted and so enthusiastic that they could tolerate my gooniness, they could tolerate my quirks, they could tolerate my weird ideas because, I wasn't gonna be here forever.
What are your hopes for the church going forward?
For Grace?
Yeah.
My hopes for Grace going forward, oh my goodness. You know, my sense of Grace when I arrived here was that they were a hidden gem. My fear for Grace is that they will continue to be a hidden gem. I want this part of the world to know this place. I want them to walk in these doors, and I want them to feel these pews cheek to jowl. And I want it to grow. because there is such a powerful, sweet, sweet spirit in this congregation. And it truly has transformed lives. It has transformed mine. It started my daughter off into a very faithful life as a young adult. It got my husband to church. This place is amazing. More people need to know about it.
Your lips to God's ears. Speaking of amazing, this is just for, unless you've got any other questions, Conrad, you've done an amazing job. Let me just add by two kind of funny things in case we need it. One is, oh, you have to sip of water first. One is how many times, and I'll ask them one by one, so you can think about it. How many times did you have to explain what a vicar was? And the other question will be about how many times did you sing Amazing Grace here? You know, and does that hymn drive you crazy, or do you love it? So there you go. You can see a little bit about what cracks me up here. So let's start with the vicar question. How many times do you remember? Feel free to make it funny.
Sure.
Having explained vicar.
So how many times did I have to explain what a vicar is? Interestingly, I had to explain that more to my co-religionists in the community than I ever did here at Grace. Grace knew what a vicar was, for heaven's sake. That's what they lived with. But in the Greater New Lenox Ministerial Association, vicar? What vicar? So yes, that was a vocabulary word with which much of the local area is unfamiliar. And then I live in a vicarage. That was a thing. That was definitely a thing.
Did that pop? That's what I think it was a water bottle.
I think it was my water bottle exploding.
Can you try to recapture just that line where you're saying
Just that sentence.
about living in a vicarage also?
Yes. So the word vicar was a word that my co-religionists, I guess I could call them, my fellow pastors in the New Lenox Ministerial Association, they did not know the word. I mean, it meant something different certainly to the Lutherans than it does to Episcopalians. It certainly means something different to the Roman Catholics. I had to explain over and over again. I loved that I lived in a vicarage because it just sounded so very British. Vicarage, yes.
Perfect. And then finally, Amazing Grace. Did you, where do you fall on that hymn? Oversung or can't sing it enough?
The hymn Amazing Grace, I have to tell you, actually, it is one of my favorites. It is not one of the favorites of my current organist in my current church, and so we don't sing it nearly as often as I would like. I don't pull rank on hymns in that way. We would sing it here, and I loved it. It spoke to me, and it clearly spoke to a great many people, not simply because this is Grace Church, but because it is such a powerful hymn of redemption and of turning. And, our call as Christians is to turn all the time. The story behind the hymn, of a slave trader coming to awareness and turning his ship around, that turning. I happen to love the hymn. A great many people do not. I fully understand that. Now, the hymn that drove me craziest here that I did not love and did not want to sing is I Am the Bread of Life, which, as we're taping this, we have just now finished 5 weeks of I'm the Bread of Life, and I was really done with I'm the Bread of Life, not only in terms of the year B lectionary, but singing that hymn, yes.
We'll have to agree to disagree. I can sing that one every week. I am over the lectionary, though. I'm very excited. Just before we stop, I can't remember, was Frank Griswold still bishop here when you started, or had he already moved up to 815?
Frank Griswold had already moved on to,
Jim mentioned him.
yes. Frank had, he was bishop when I was at Emmanuel, yes.
Gotcha.
Yeah, and Bill Purcell was bishop here.
Right, okay. I can't think of anything else. Is there anything we didn't ask that you wanted to talk about? covered a lot of ground.
We covered a lot of ground. Yeah,
That's great.
yeah.
35 minutes.
Ah, wonderful. That's great.
So do we need to
I keep it
redo
all.
any of these?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
I mean, I'm envisioning it's going to be chopped up.
Oh, of course,
not,
of
not
course.
sequence, you know. But,
Sure.
And when you or Jim or Ellen mention things, you know, feel like it's my job to get you material that you can cut
Right.
to and show.
Right, right. The
Especially-
one thing you didn't ask about was when I arrived here, the big fundraiser was the ham dinner.
Oh, yeah. Let's do the ham dinner.
The ham dinner.
Sorry. I assumed it was over.
Oh,
by the
well,
time you got
it
here.
nearly was. It had lost energy.
Got
We
it.
can talk about that. The
Yeah,
ham
let's do
dinner.
that. Great. Thank you. Jim talked about it a lot because he couldn't stand it. So.
Okay,
Okay, you ready?
Yeah.
okay.
So tell me about the ham dinner.
So when I arrived here, the big fundraiser, and obviously the fundraisers that we did were for the operating fund. I mean, these were not outreach funds that we were raising. This was to pay the bills. Was the ham dinner, and Grace had been doing this for decades, near as I could tell. And by the time I arrived, it was beginning to lose some steam. I think that some of the people who had been doing it for years and years were just they were done. They were done with it. So we needed to cast about for a new fundraiser that would have some energy and some interest and all of that. And so we started paying attention to what some other churches were doing, and other Episcopal churches were doing a lobster boil. And so we thought, well, heck, let's try that. And so with typical Grace due diligence, went off and interviewed churches that did it and how did it work and what have you learned. And in very short order, this got put together and was a hoot. A hoot and a half. We had a great time with it. I don't know if it's still going on. I trust that things have moved on at this point, but we did that for 4 of the 5 years that I was at Grace.
We do Italian night. Was that going on when you were here?
No, but I love that idea.
They've done barbecues and Italian night.
Yeah.
And a lot of it lobster. Me neither. Yes, it must have been a while. Interesting. Maybe lobster was too expensive.
They flew them in live, and we sold them live, and then we cooked them on site, cooked them to order, and people drove up and we handed them off. And
But that's in the spirit of the ham dinner, really. I mean, it sounds very similar. Just you get the community involved.
yep.
Sue, this is amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And
It's been
for
fun to talk about it.
Especially sharing the personal story for Katie. So I might follow up with you to see if you got even just pictures of her at that age.
I do have pictures of her at that
It
age.
doesn't have to be doing that Oren's position.
Right.
But when we mention her, I think it'd be great to see.
Yeah.
We may need some photos from you of the time period too, if you don't mind.
Sure,
Yeah.
sure. Yeah, I'll go through I've got
There was
some
less
clippings. There's a
graphics.
big spread on me in the local paper when I arrived because I was the first
good.
person to
Oh,
start.
I'd love to see that,
let me
yeah.
See if I can dig that
They
out.
must do that for all of us.
Send that to you.
This was amazing. And so you were just finishing up sabbatical, is that right?
I've just finished up sabbatical, yeah. So I've been doing it with Siemens Church, which the ministry on the rivers. So I've been down on the Ohio and the Tennessee, and most recently on the Upper Illinois. And it's been.
For 3 months?
I'm sorry.
How long? 3 months?
No, I wish.